Hello, and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. And today we are privileged to welcome back Dr. Christopher Harmon, who is a professor at the Institute of World Politics. He formerly held the Bren Chair of Great Power Competition at Marine Corps University in Quantico. Dr. Harmon also directed the counterterrorism course at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. He directed academics in the counterterrorism program of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. Earlier, he was legislative aide for foreign policy on a congressional staff. He taught 4 years on the strategy and policy faculty at the Naval War College, and then served at length as a professor of international relations at the Marines Command and Staff College in Virginia. From 2005 to 2007, Dr. Harmon held an endowed chair for Insurgency and Terrorism Studies at Marine Corps University. He held another chair there from 2010 to 2014, researching low-intensity conflicts in Asia and writing A Citizen's Guide to Terrorism and Counterterrorism. Dr. Harmon has edited or written 8 books, including Toward a Grand Strategy Against Terrorism and The Terrorist Argument, Modern Advocacy and Propaganda. The latter book's thesis was presented by him at a Westminster Institute lecture back in 2017. He also spoke at the Westminster Institute on How Terrorist Groups End. I invite our audience to go back to those lectures, which are on our YouTube channel. Today, Dr. Harmon will be speaking on the subject of his latest book, Warfare in Peacetime, Proxies and State Powers, published by the Marine Corps University Press. Chris, welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. I was enjoying the chance to study while at Marine Corps University the problem of proxy warfare, and got quite intrigued with why states get into the business and all the difficulties. And in fact, the book emphasizes the difficulties of being involved in proxy warfare relations. It makes sense, I think, to start with the definition that I used in the book. I say that for international relations purposes, a good one might be this, that the proxy is a state or sub-state actor that either in part or wholly knowingly acts internationally on behalf of a stronger party and thus serves interests of that dominant party. So there are plenty of possible definitions for a proxy. It's a familiar term for us in law and in any other ways, but that's not a bad start for international relations maybe. I chose a number of case studies. I was interested in at least 4 of the great powers and some of the minor powers as well, so we could get multiple perspectives of who's involved in a proxy relationship. And the book also includes quite a lot of sub-state actors, as the poli-sci types would say today. I chose some 11 factors to look at in each of the case studies in the hope of linking these together with some sinews. And I think that was a successful enterprise. It certainly shows in the beginning the uniqueness of some of these states and their rationale for engaging in proxy relations, to be sure. But then many of the 11 factors allowed me to look at things which run common through the cases. The factors' strengths or weaknesses were often variable. They might be strong, they might be neutral. There might be a real weak relationship in a certain pattern, as with, say, arms traffic, but then that changes during the course of the study. So it was then a combination of state powers, of multiple sizes, sub-state actors, and trying to understand factors which are common to all of them. I start among these 11 then with attention to what's unique about a particular relationship between a proxy and a sponsor. There's a chapter on China. It's very interesting because very few people know about the United Wa State Army, but it's a heavily armed insurgent group that controls a lot of territory within Burma, now called Myanmar. And not since, say, 1976-7 have the Chinese been involved too much overseas with revolutionary parties, and certainly not so much today. But in the case of the United Wa State Army, this is a sub-state actor which is truly a proxy and has territory and is armed. And it's not particularly Maoist in ideology, but it is in fact a proxy and an insurgency. I look at the political character of groups. So when we think about Cuba and East Germany, two of the states I examine in the book, it's clear that the linkage there is that of Marxism-Leninism. They both adhere to Moscow's purposes, but it's a deeper commitment to ideology that I think we want to attend to. It unites the East Germans with the Cubans, with the Soviets, and with many of their third world allies. I try to look at the strategic context of each. So India, for example, is an interesting chapter because I'm examining the relationship they have with the LTTE Tigers, the Tamils, who were destroyed in 2009. I haven't been able to find a really good argument in power, in realpolitik, why India should be so involved with that particular group. They didn't have a need to wreck Sri Lanka. It's too small for them to worry about. They didn't see a particular threat from another great power. So I'll speak to that. But they have an unusual strategic context in that they don't do this as a direct weapon against another capital city. I looked at formal status when I could, including written accords. So one of the exciting things I know you'd remember from the 80s very well is all the Grenada papers, which were brought back from the New Jewel Movement archives in Grenada in 1983. These thoroughly document their integration with the Soviet bloc, which was an effort that Mr. Reagan nipped in the bud by invading the island and saving the medical students there. But those were some formal relationships which were developing, and we have the papers on that. And it's quite amazing to read through many of the Grenada papers. They show a formal status for this proxy relationship. Political support, obviously enough, is important. For example, the United States, when it worked with UNITA in Angola, had an indulgent view of Jonas Savimbi and the UNITA movement, and Savimbi even got a White House appointment. He spoke at the Heritage Foundation. He had lobbyists in Washington, and there was a strong developing relationship between the American people and the tribe he led in Angola. I look at arms flow. Of course, that's always an important indicator in international relations terms of a proxy relationship, or it could be a partnership. African groups were getting weapons from the Warsaw Pact generally, not just Moscow. And I think some of our security studies literature could do with more emphasis on that. The Czechs, the East Germans were providing weapons, not just the Soviets, in the Third World fights. Intelligence coordination is very important. It's a hallmark of a good relationship between allies. But it also is something that develops with proxies, and so I looked at those. Logistics, economic and political integration. The last couple I looked at include primary source statements. I believed in developing a lot of that terrorism work you kindly referred to, that we tend to pay attention to terrorist incidents, the number of people killed, what some professor or journalist says about it. We don't tend to look at the primary sources of the groups. We should read their founding documents. It would teach us a great deal. In the case of Hezbollah, which I know is a group you've studied closely, their 1983 open letter states specifically about the relationship with Tehran, quote, "We abide by the orders of Khomeini." What a remarkable statement of subordination to Tehran that's made by these Lebanese of Hezbollah. So it struck me as one of the most important things that Hezbollah ever published. But I got to say, when was the last time I ever saw that line in print? It's readily available. It explains a lot about the relationship between Iran and their Shia friends in Hezbollah. The last part is pretty, I hope, original. I took a look at what I call third level extensions, and I'm looking there for the right language to show where a proxy has a proxy and that one begins to develop his own proxies. Grenada is a good case. I mean, the Soviets work with Cuba, and then Cuba turns out to be key to the future of the New Jewel movement in Grenada. And so that's a good example of these sort of third level extensions. But it also points ahead to that interesting question about how much control the original sponsor has. If he creates an effect or partners with a proxy, but that one then goes off on its own, is that factor of control significant? Could that cause problems for them in the future? Well, to turn to the first case study, I looked at the German Democratic Republic. An interesting name, not wholly German, certainly not democratic, and not a republic. An important state, an important part of the Warsaw Pact. I found the unique part about them is just being openly avowed to Moscow. They weren't too shy about being discussed as part of the Soviet bloc. They seemed to openly want to be identified as the most potent, the most willing, the most helpful in the overall Marxist-Leninist effort that the Soviets were running. So they weren't shy. Something else unique about them in this was they were fighting for proxies and partners and fellow travelers overseas, as in Africa, because they were in competition with Bonn. So Berlin didn't want to be outpaced diplomatically. And so they were in direct competition for setting up formal diplomatic relations with some of these new states emerging in southern Africa or emerging anywhere in Africa. A parallel would be today with the Taiwan and China relationship. They're both looking for partners overseas, and frankly, Taipei is well behind Beijing at this point, but it's a natural rivalry. So I found that the East German relationship then was truly highly developed and very sophisticated. That was a product of their foreign ministry, their intelligence services, their defense ministry. And their engagements in Africa were quite impressive at the time. They were tech savvy, of course. East Germany had that to offer. They had a booming economy, given the comparison with most third world or communist states. They were doing well, not West German well, but they were doing well. So they could provide economic aid. They saw a role in educating third world peoples, and they bring them to Germany or send programs overseas into Central America, into Africa, and so forth. They obviously had a great deal of proficiency in martial terms. So if you're a young man trying to figure out how your armored personnel carrier works, and you've got the Germans there who made it, to train you and perhaps know your language as well. That's a wonderful thing. So they were able to do not just arms provision, but a lot of training with those on the ground. And then they were involved in a lot of covert efforts as well. I have a remarkable document which I've had translated from German, which is all about Carlos's coming and goings in the Soviet bloc. Hungary, East Germany, quite a few international terrorists had a safe haven there when they needed it, or integration in some way with various German enterprises. So the East German state is extremely important, and it was a good study in proxy warfare. I took a look next at Cuba. I found the relationship with Cuba to be well known to Americans, more so than the East German one, but much valuable to look at. The Soviets certainly don't begin that rebellion against the authorities in Cuba in the late 50s, but they capitalize on it. They're able to capture eventually that movement. Che Guevara has intelligence links into the Soviets, as described by a very nice book by John Lee Anderson, a big biography of Che, and is out in a second edition. Castro himself, Fidel, won't announce he's a communist until 2 years into the new state's existence, but 1961 brings that news. Raul, we know of. There's a integrated treaty system in which they're part of Comecon, the Council of Mutual Economic Aid, not part of the Warsaw Pact, but they do have an official role in that respect. The intelligence linkages is very important set of factors to look at. Extremely significant to see in the late 60s, people imagine, there's an increasing takeover of the DGI, the Intelligence Service of Cuba, by the Soviet sponsors. And eventually, the two are working absolutely in tandem. They had a place with no less than 1,500 technicians and specialists in a place called Lourdes in Cuba, which is interesting today to remember that, given the Chinese footprint, however large or small, in Cuba, which is the most recent news from the Wall Street Journal. So it's a important relationship and developed on quite a lot of levels. And I think most Americans know a great deal about the economic aid, for example, that the Soviets gave. The Cubans and the East Germans then were central to the Soviet enterprises. To turn to the United States, they of course are a full-blown participant in the Cold War. They are looking to match Soviet gains or reduce them when they can. The Americans under Mr. Reagan had a particularly influential thing called the Reagan Doctrine, which explicitly tried to aid anti-communist guerrillas in their own country. So that could be Cambodia, that could be Afghanistan, the famous case. They're also in Angola, and the United States partner in that case is an extremely impressive man named Jonas Savimbi. PhD from a Swiss university, former couple of visits to Mao Zedong's China, was willing to learn wherever he could. He's not a Maoist, but in this case study, he's begun to build within his sector of Angola a very broad and well-governed and reasonable political entity. And the United States is engaged with him and begins to supply weaponry. I knew a Marine who was an intelligence liaison at that time. He's passed, unfortunately. The United States provides Stinger missiles to Jonas Savimbi's UNITA guerrilla organization. It's called UNITA. And that all develops, I think, in part due to the amazing personality of Dr. Savimbi. Because the very first contacts we had with Angolan rebels, which were very limited, were with a different group, the FNLA of Holden Roberto. And the United States did little with him, withdrew, and then comes back interested in working with UNITA in Angola. Like a lot of proxy war stories, this one doesn't end too well. it was promising. They did a great job against the MPLA government of Angola, which was heavily, heavily funded and backed by no end of Soviet bloc activities, equipment, commitments, air forces, you name it. Savimbi did well. He was a natural guerrilla leader. But the United States had a couple of issues about that. The Secretary of State at the time felt that too much aid to this man in Angola could damage the overall concerns about Southern Africa. A great illustration of one of the problems in proxy war. Larger interests sometimes are more important. That was an issue. There was also a kind of red herring. The UNITA organization had taken a limited amount of aid from Republic of South Africa under apartheid. And at the time, of course, there's a national and international movement against everything apartheid. So this was electric in Congress, as you would remember, Bob, from your time around the Hill. The bare mention of any aid from the South Africans to Savimbi was toxic, and it really made the debates difficult in terms of our assistance to Angola. I say a red herring. It's pretty unimaginable that this coal-black, noble African coming to power in Angola on the basis of his tribal strength as well as a national Angolan strength, that he would be a toady to the apartheid people. It's literally comical, but only in a black comic way, because it hurt the U.S. aid assistance to UNITA. And they did not win, and the MPLA communist government prevailed. It's, in that sense, a sorrowful story. A couple case studies in Asia here might be interesting. I mentioned the Indian program of assistance to Tamils. Initially, it was promiscuous. The Indian state and the sub-state of Tamil Nadu, one of the states within the federal system of India, were openly supporting Tamil insurgents and militancy in Sri Lanka, the small island off the southern coast. They had a range of groups. One or two had strong Marxist interests, and most were nationalist. The LTT emerges largely by brute force and skill of their leader Prabhakaran, but he also murdered other Tamil militants. So purportedly a Tamil nationalist, he was quite willing to murder Tamil nationalists who weren't in the LTTE Tigers. This is a good premonition about the way this group's going to fight and the way it's going to master terrorism in its region. The Indians, for a variety of reasons, starting with sympathy for Tamils, who were a minority in Sri Lanka, but of tens of millions by number in southern India. There's a sentimental and kind of cultural link up there in religion, language, and so forth. I think the Indians also, as part of the non-aligned movement, were always looking to champion an underdog. There was, as close as you can get to a great power controversy here, the Indians judged, apparently, that the United States was becoming too interested in one or two of the harbors in Sri Lanka. At the same time, they were liaising with China under the Kissinger-Nixon plan. And some think this created tension in India. And the concern was that the United States was sort of moving into the area, and therefore perhaps it would make sense to give assistance to Tamil militants and have a stronger impact against the government in Colombo, the Sri Lankan government. That's a bit far-fetched, but that's as far as we can go in terms of a real rational purpose. We do know that India systematically, within the state of Tamil Nadu, trained and led and educated these guerrillas. They gave them no end of weapons, money. They sent them back and forth across the Palk Straits into Sri Lanka. It caused horrible problems in a democratic state, the Sri Lankan state. And it was a nasty thing to do. And the interesting thing is it didn't work at all. another case of proxy war failure. India, having tried, as we might say, to ride the tiger, having cultivated the Tamil Tigers and given them everything they could imagine, from weapons to medical assistance, loses control, which is a great problem in proxy warfare. Ask Mr. Putin about Wagner Group. So India loses control of the Tamil Tigers, and in the end feels compelled with the government of Sri Lanka to introduce an Indian peacekeeping force, so-called, for 3 years at the end of the 80s. They end up fighting the very Tamils they had trained and armed, and they also get in quarrels with all kinds of other Sri Lankans. It goes very badly. The Indians withdraw from Sri Lanka, bloodied, actually. A great state causing problems for a very small one, and in the end not even successful in achieving anything. One other Asian study, before I turn to kind of some closing remarks about what the book tries to do. With Chris Booth, an Army specialist, we took a look at the situation in Myanmar, which is somewhat inchoate. There's no end of kind of semi-autonomous political entities, zones of control. I'm not sure it's any more disciplined now under the colonel's regime. But the remarkable rise over the years on the China border and the Thai border has been these peoples, the Wa, who are in what's called Shan state within Burma. They are armed, uniformed, everything else by the Chinese. They have third generation man-pads, the shoulder-fired missiles that can take down aircraft. They have fine new assault rifles and uniforms. They are a professional-looking, well-trained group. They're within Myanmar, but they're on the border with China, and they're able to dominate all kinds of influences that go back and forth across that border too.
How many are there?
There's at least 20 to 25,000, I think, under arms. It's a serious group, and they do control a zone within Myanmar. That's a relationship to watch. What's fascinating and unique about it is China's relations with the capital in Myanmar remain very good. China's economic roles there, very powerful. So China has two weapons here. China has all the usual state-to-state weaponry that any partnership involves. And China has this special weapon of its proxy within Myanmar called the United Wa State Army. And they can use that, gun it up, turn the heat up or down with that little tool. We haven't seen them doing it so much, but they have that potential. And I think it's a fascinating case in which China has clearly shown powerful interest in what's going on abroad.
But if I could just interrupt with a question, with what objective in mind would China ramp them up?
Well, if for example, the Burmese government was unfavorable about particular economic relations, or was questioning some of their part in the Belt and Road Initiative, we have seen some pressures exerted on that front. So it's the problem of being a small state beside a great one like China. They're not trying to spread Maoism, they're using power. And so I think that's a relationship which is probably successful. So we've seen a balance of successes and failures in this short chat here. And the way I want to close is the way the book closes is with a chapter about all the problems that a proxy owner has, a proxy manager has. So if we have a limited relationship with a lawyer having to do with a proxy relationship on a house sale or something, that could become complicated. State-to-state affairs and sub-state actors cause just the same kinds of problems and troubles. So if we think about the Ukraine today and the attention given to the Wagner Group, it's a good example of the kinds of stress factors that I outline at the end of the book. First of all, the state, it could be Moscow or it could be Washington. If trying to work with a proxy is on the table, that will always have to compete with another large issue. You might have the greatest initiative in the world, but if it competes with what your government's doing with China, with Russia, with NATO, that could cast a pall over your plans for developing some spicy, covert proxy somewhere. State concerns are often much larger. Today, the Ukrainian issue is so big for Putin that I'm sure he doesn't worry as much about Wagner Group as we do. I think he worries a lot more about the Ukraine situation, and it rather dwarfs right now his attention to remnants of the Wagner Group, I think. Fear of exposure. Wagner's been getting exposed for a long time. When you're a democratic state, as we remember with the Contras arguments, for example, that tore up Washington in the 80s when we were working with the Contras as a partner in Central America, we were very concerned about levels of exposure. There are certain things we were doing covertly. Many of the regional partners, for example, there or with Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, wanted covert action. They didn't want everything to be transparent and voted on and discussed on the floor of the House. So we might discuss something one day in the Senate and the House, and the next day we might do something quietly. We had complex relations like that with some of the Polish interests, like Solidarity. So, question of exposure. Putin wouldn't want most of the press that he's getting now. The United States often didn't want press. Concern about control couldn't be more clear. When you hire a proxy, you often get a gunslinger. You often get somebody with no allegiance. You might get a Victor Bout. You might get any number of people. It's unclear what you've really got. And it can be dangerous as a matter of statecraft. You have intelligence services, you have a Ministry of Defense, you have a lot of other ways, you have allies who might help do your will abroad. When you hire mercenaries, you're not sure you can control them. Costs. Very frequently, these wars get embroiled in things, the costs start to rise, and the complexity of a situation can be overwhelming. So you might hire your proxy to do certain things, and it turns out the situation is immensely more complex, or you're bogged down in a foreign war where you thought you were doing a quick coup d'etat. So states have had trouble with the rising costs. Being bogged down is one of the things I address in the book. And then there are physical restraints and legal restraints. The moral and legal ones are very interesting for us as democracies. After watching for a long time the workings of the Reagan Doctrine, Malcolm Wallop of Wyoming wrote an article in Strategic Review basically saying this is too hard to do with anything covert. If we're going to do this, we may as well do it all above board. If we're going to have these partners in foreign wars, we better tell the American people, and we better make the authorizations public. I've mentioned how contentious that can be. Many partners don't want aid like that. They actually want it quiet for their own purposes. But it's an example of the way in which these things become public, and then they might become a legal issue or a moral issue. And with the Iran-Contra problems, we found ourselves enmeshed in both. And that too ends badly, doesn't it? It ends with a really great idealistic concept. Its resistance to a regime in Nicaragua, which was in the papers last week for closing yet another university. Daniel Ortega's doing precisely what he's been doing all of his life since 1979. And so we had a kind of limited proxy relationship with the Contras, which ended up being a sad conclusion.
Well, Chris, let me ask you a question about Nicaragua, because it seemed to be a qualified success when there was a transition through an election with Violeta Chamorro becoming president of the country, who was running La Prensa. And that seemed to be, that was really a very fine moment. However, it didn't last too long.
Yeah.
And it turned out, much to the frustration of members of the Coordinadora who had been struggling and fighting for a democratic transition for so many years, that certain members of the business community in Nicaragua, who engaged in some questionable practices, were extremely happy to get in bed with the Sandinistas, who would provide them with political protection and let them keep their ill-gotten gains.
I see.
And then we know that the Ortegas came back and that the nightmare of Nicaragua resumed. So I think of Nicaragua as a lost victory. The follow-on work to help them prevent something like that from happening wasn't there. And it's very frustrating, of course, for everyone and for those of us who worked so hard on that issue in the 1980s.
Yes. The United States could have done much more to help determine their future. After the success of the July '79 revolution, so much changed so quickly that was so negative. And the State Department, to its credit, worked against that. They tried to collaborate with as many Nicaraguan partners as they could, cultural, educational figures, the church, universities, political parties, people who did La Prensa. Point is a good one. The United States disappointments are very severe in July of '79. And then there's a kind of systematic takeover of the institutions and people of Nicaragua by their party. It's clearly a one party state, and was apparent in the rise of the Sandinistas, both in their methods and their statements. There is still somewhat of an open society for moments there after '79. It's ironic that the criticisms of the Somoza dictatorship had been so strong, and so there was so much attention to the numbers of people he jailed, for example. But one of the first reports out of the State Department had to do with the increase in the size of jails in Nicaragua because they had so many new political prisoners, they didn't know where to put them. It had not been a militarized society. It was a nasty army, to be sure, with plenty of depredations to its record. But by the numbers, it hadn't expanded in that totalitarian way that we would associate with, say, Cuba or other governments that we've discussed today. And so the numbers of people in militias or regular armed services was markedly low. That changed. And the Sandinistas, with the whole concept of militias and village self-defense and factory self-defense and parades in the city, they really militarized the country. And the tragedy was that there were plenty of smart people in the Senate and the House, State Department, that had seen what the Sandinistas were and worked against them. But that's not how it worked out. We find ourselves then today looking back to a party that was led at the time by Daniel Ortega, and which has the same principles and which is showing us the ugly side of totalitarianism. I guess you mentioned it could be considered a partial victory in the beginning. One thing we should add, I know, is we probably saved the life of El Salvador. That gets less attention than it should. We handled that differently. We had the conception of a very limited counterinsurgency team and never, I think military terms, never went over 55. We gave them a massive economic aid. We tried to support democratic parties, the judiciary, but we knew that was the next ground of the fight. And it was the Salvadoran guerrillas were formidable. The instant, and this is a great proxy war, you've got the Soviets in Cuba, so they're backing Nicaragua. The instant they win in '79, they begin pumping stuff into El Salvador. It's an amazing flow to watch. And so the problem for them was existential, and they have survived. And in that sense, the United States, I think, helped stabilize the region. Mr. Reagan spoke in Costa Rica as well to the parliament, which was a massive success politically, I thought, and a very fine thing to do. So in those kinds of ways, the White House tried to resist the trend, and the Grenada intervention was successful too. But with Nicaragua, we ended up losing, and we lost a lot of friends there, and a lot of good people who had a right to an open society and have surrendered it to the Sandinistas.
You know what it makes me think of, Chris, is that the Soviet Union did have a Brezhnev doctrine. Once you're a communist state, you're always a communist state.
Yeah.
And they also had the means to ensure that by putting in intelligence services and control and to ensure that anyone who was going to contest the communist nature of their proxy would be taken care of, would be eliminated, so they could consolidate that.
Yeah.
Whereas the United States, as in the case of Nicaragua, were perfectly happy and they were somewhat adept at helping them defeat the Sandinistas to the point that there was a democratic transition. But we weren't there to help them consolidate it, not only in the way that you talked about El Salvador, where there was judicial reform and this kind of thing, but the United States doesn't simply have the character to do the kinds of things the Soviet Union would do or the East Germans would do.
That's
to
true.
Consolidate,
Yeah.
control, and viciously at times eliminate any opposition to the consolidation of their proxy. Not so much talking about regime change as helping the new regime, the Violeta Chamorro regime,
Yeah.
consolidate
Yeah.
their victory, so that that there's a continuation and not a relapse into the Sandinistas, which is what happened.
Yes.
So the Sandinistas were successful in subverting her regime, and having another go at it, and that's what I'm talking about. That
Yes.
if we were East Germans, we wouldn't have allowed that to happen. We would have seen the transition consolidated, so that new head of state would remain, or the democratic institutions would develop there. Now, unless you want to comment on that, I have another question.
Please.
Let's look at the case of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So we have proxies there. Is Afghanistan a case of our seeing our proxies imperiled to the point that we take them over? That we go in, as we did for 20 years in that country, to ourselves try to institute the kind of regime we thought they wanted?
I think our prospects for doing that in Afghanistan would have been pretty grim. I don't think that would have been the right strategic choice, although
we failed.
we did so badly with some of our choices that it's definitely worth discussing. I think the best strategic option might well have been to go in, run the Al-Qaeda people out, run Taliban out, as we did, and then not try to do serious government construction. That as a strategic option in the rearview mirror now, that would look pretty smart. And at the time, there was great resistance to any sort of conception of nation building. We seem to have done fairly badly in the Middle East. We couldn't do well at all in Somalia. I don't think prospects in Afghanistan were a lot better than they would have been, say, in Somalia. And so I don't think we have enough expertise in this area.
In your book, Chris, you mentioned FDR having passed through Congress the Neutrality Act to keep Americans from individually or privately engaging in war against another nation with which the United States is not at war. So in other words, Americans aren't supposed to go overseas and freelance in conflicts, right? I'm not sure everybody attends to that prohibition. I'm going to ask you about a case concerning Myanmar, and I know some people personally who were very much involved. They are very fine people. One was Christian Freedom International that was trying to help the Koreans. And of course, there would be a big refugee flow across the Thai border, and they would seek to, in a humanitarian way, help the Koreans because the Myanmar army would be going after them, and they could be very violent, burning their villages and shooting. Now, I do know an American who, in a similar situation, goes across the border and trains militarily. Not the Korean, but another minority that the Myanmar has been extremely rough on, to try to help them in this way. What is your reaction to that kind of behavior?
It is extremely difficult legally, and it reminds me of a case of when some Cambodians based in Los Angeles or Long Beach were prosecuted some many years ago for being involved in Cambodian affairs. So the Cambodian government is a rather loathsome despotism. It's now being passed from father to son, it looks like, based on the latest elections. And you could have any good number of good ideas about how to support change in Cambodia. But when it came to armed action, these Americans fell afoul of our laws. And so that was snuffed. I know now that in Myanmar, there must be no end of interested foreign parties because there are such diverse factions, some armed, some not, many trying to go overt, many Burmese now set upon the fight, absolutely determined to be guerrillas until they get change. And it's a very impressive, and for an American, our country's founded on rebellion, it's a very impressive display of courage. But we can easily run afoul of our own laws or against those of Burmese and be treated, as spies or combatants, I suppose, under some circumstances. I think the usual way we Americans have dealt with this is not martial, but in terms of politics and in terms of economic assistance. In the Poland case, for example, we managed to have considerable impact without ever crossing the difficult line you and I are discussing now. And there was never a question of American guerrillas, starting yet another uprising in Warsaw. We did a beautiful job getting money in covertly, getting ink and press materials for their Solidarity newspaper, which I'm proud to own a couple of copies. This was overtly discussed, but then there'd be covert deliveries, but we were never combatants. And we left that to the Poles, who are certainly a muscular people when it comes to fighting oppression. I suppose that there are options for lots of kind of training outside Burma, and I suppose that there are Americans who, if they go in, are risking everything by doing.
You alluded to the success in Poland and, of course, the Cold War. As you know, the major problem the United States is facing now, perhaps could be the largest problem it ever faced, is China and China's aspirations. And we know that China behaves in ways to achieve its objective with what we call whole of government. Everyone is on board. There's not a government institution or a private, there are no private institutions in China. There are quasi-private ones, which nonetheless the Communist Party controls. And therefore, they have every tool to use, whether it's the BRICS or whether it's military aid, whether it's bags of money to legislators to corrupt them and get them on board in the Pacific Islands. They're uninhibited and they're highly coordinated. Well, I don't know whether you would call, therefore, a Pacific island that is more or less preempted by Chinese corruption and economic aid and so forth a proxy. But they're more likely to succeed than the United States, which is not a whole-of-government effort, as you know.
Right.
We're not a whole-of-government effort. We don't have that capability to coordinate, which would seem to me, Chris, to simply say, we don't have that native ability to succeed in proxy wars. And maybe that's not a tool we ought to pursue. Is that too pessimistic?
I think the case of the Afghans, which we discussed, brings us back. If we forget the 20 years crisis, to abuse the title of an old book, and think about the withdrawal, but go beyond that back to the triumph of the Mujahideen. That's one of a number of cases where we were much more successful with, in some respect, managing a proxy. Now, there's a big power difference. Their idealism was even greater than ours. They took all the risks, we took fewer, but we did a good job with intelligence and money and military advice and good hard weapons. And it was extremely successful. It helped them, and it wasn't the worst of the militants in terms of Salafism that succeed in that case. It's a coalition of people. Some of them were very good, and it was not, as certain Americans now imagine, that the Taliban. Sorry, they weren't there. They didn't exist yet. It was a highly successful war in the 80s. It did a lot to bring down the Soviet Union. Sun Tzu has no higher praise than for the general who can win a war without fighting. We never had to go to general war against the Soviets. And so, as your question suggested, it's an amazing finish in the Cold War case. Mr. Reagan gets a lot of credit for that. And part of the credit is for the one or two successes we did have within the Reagan Doctrine concept. There's a brand new book out. It's a third edition of an important war studies book called The New Makers of Modern Strategy. There have been 1943 and 1986 editions. This one doesn't say anything about the Reagan Doctrine, on which you spent some of your life. Or for so many others, Senator Gordon Humphrey, Congressman Jim Corder, intelligence man Konstantin Mengies, worked so hard in their careers for the Reagan Doctrine and the recipients. We do admit to the defeat with respect to the Contras in most ways, and the Savimbi's dead and gone, and Angola remains communist. But on the other hand, the victory in Afghanistan was the one thing that our old friend Jack Wheeler promised was needed, that if the Soviets could be defeated, even in just one theater, it would have that kind of effect that you have with a serious-looking vessel which could break, however, on one sharp contact. They lost that theater, and it really tended to break their morale and help show Gorbachev that they couldn't defeat the administration or the Americans.
That was an impressive rollback.
It was, and we never accepted in the containment theories of the 50s the full program of rollback. But the Reagan Doctrine was a brilliant exercise in power, which I call limited rollback, where we only were attacking new communist regimes, and we were only doing it by support to indigenous forces. Conceptually, that's terribly bright. Something some people never thought Ronald Reagan could manage. It's his idea, it's Jack Wheeler's idea, it's a great idea, and that was successful enough that I don't want to close our good conversation here by saying that we simply can't work with proxies. I think There are a few cases where we've done well, and that's an ennobling case in a way. We did the right things morally, and they had the right practical effect.
I'll just rain on that parade a little bit.
Okay.
Because in the book you mentioned that the United States funneled its aid to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's ISI.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that Afghans have told me is that the ISI, they of course had their proxies since they were in control of our money, and whom they supported in the Mujahideen were not necessarily the ones who would have made a different kind of Afghanistan. That really contaminated our support and undermined the future. Okay, you say there wasn't the Taliban then, but there was an array of Islamic different kinds of understandings of Islam, from the Pacific folk Islam that was characteristic of Afghanistan, to the more radical kind of Islam which Pakistan itself was sponsoring. And I find that we Americans, once again, in our cultural deficit, didn't know enough to examine the character of the people we were supporting through the Pakistan's ISI and what they were doing with the money.
Our understanding of Afghanistan is amazingly limited.
And of Islam itself.
CIA gets a lot of credit for putting together the first ground teams to get in there and do as well as they could. As you'll remember, one of the smartest things that Al-Qaeda did was murder Massoud, who would have been he could have been the emir of the future, the king of the future Afghan Republic, or whatever state they wanted. That was a very clever move. It was one of the best uses of international terrorism I've seen in my lifetime. So those changes were dramatic. And I'm certainly with you as to the emergence of Taliban. From '94 onward, they are a proxy of Pakistan. And Pakistan is a most troubled security partner with respect to the U.S. because, as has always been true, there are things we work well with them on and things where they simply never will serve our interests. And ironically, they've found out, as have other regimes, how hard it is to run operations. So the Tehrik-i Taliban is attacking Pakistani interests left and right. So they continue there and in Baluchistan and other places to face real terrorism concerns, even though they effectively sponsored terrorism in a couple other cases, as with the Taliban.
I'll close, Chris, just by mentioning a parallel case to the assassination of al-Massoud, and that was in Iraq in the early days after overthrowing the Saddam regime. Al-Houthi, one of the great Shia leaders, returned from London.
Mm-hmm.
And Al-Houthi was of extremely significant Shia figure and religious figure and leader who was dedicated to turning Iraq into a constitutional democratic regime. He had a big following.
Yeah.
And so I forget whether he was in al-Najaf, but I remember the day he was assassinated. And my heart sank, and I thought, there it goes.
Yeah.
That's the parallel to getting Massoud in Afghanistan. And those are the kind of nasty things that the other side is capable of doing to make sure it's their proxy instead of ours.
Yes, agreed.
Well, anyway, this is a very rich and complicated and subtle subject, and I want to thank Dr. Chris Harmon, who is a professor at the Institute of World Politics, for joining me today to discuss his new book, Warfare in Peacetime. I can't recommend this book more highly because of its richness, its subtlety, its comprehensiveness in addressing this subject. So of course, I think I could fairly say you could go to the website of the Marine Corps University Press and actually download a PDF of this book or request the hard copy that I have. So I highly recommend that, and I thank Dr. Harmon for coming. Now, I would like to encourage our viewers to see what other offerings we have at the Westminster Institute by going to our webpage or our YouTube channel, where you will see other lectures and discussions on the subject of China, Japan, Taiwan, a lot of interesting discussions on the Ukraine-Russia war, and other things, the causes of inflation and other things that I hope that you would find interesting. I'm Robert Riley. Thank you for joining us.